Stop right there. What do you think you're doing to my father?" The voice of Richard Sterling cut through the silence like a blade. He had just returned from a sudden overseas trip, a 42-year-old white billionaire. Tall, broad-shouldered, still in his travel-creased suit, his tie loosened but his authority intact. He had not announced his arrival. He wanted to surprise the household. Instead, it was he who stood shocked, frozen in the doorway of his father's room. Inside, chaos. Henry Sterling, his father, a 73-year-old white man with thinning silver hair and a body worn fragile by illness and time, was flailing weakly, his voice rising in panic. His eyes, clouded by months of cognitive decline, darted around in terror. He was trying to force himself forward, to rise, but his legs betrayed him, and his frail body shook as though at war with itself. Blocking his path stood Amina Johnson, a 29-year-old black maid. She wore the plain gray uniform of the staff, slightly faded at the collar from too many washes, and her dark skin glistened with sweat, her arms stretched out, body pressed against Henry to stop him from toppling forward. From the doorway, however, it looked damning, her posture not protective but forceful, as though restraining him against his will. Henry's voice cracked with fear. "This maid, she's trying to hurt me. Let me go. Let me go." Richard's heart slammed against his chest. His father, the man who had built empires and commanded boardrooms, now reduced to this fragile, frightened shell, and before him, a servant of no consequence, at least in his eyes, seemingly the source of danger. Rage surged. "Amina," Richard thundered, calling her by name for the first time in weeks. "Step away from him. Right now." Amina turned, startled, her wide eyes brimming with confusion. "Sir, I wasn't, please. You don't understand." Her voice faltered under the weight of accusation. She hadn't finished before the door burst wider. Margaret Collins, the housekeeper, swept in like a storm. A white woman in her late 50s, Margaret had served the Sterling estate for decades. Her sharp cheekbones and tightly pinned blonde hair gave her an air of command. "Wait a second. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us." She had long considered herself the guardian of the household's dignity, and with that self-appointed role came an instinct to control the narrative before anyone else could. "I told you," Margaret snapped, her voice pitched high with righteous fury. "I warned you she was dangerous, always lurking, always too close to Mr. Sterling. Now you see for yourself." Behind her came two more staff, both white, both eager to nod along, eager to prove loyalty to the family line. One muttered, "I've seen her sneaking around upstairs." Another added, "She never knows her place." The air thickened with accusation. Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze darting between his father's frightened face, the maid's desperate eyes, and the chorus of voices condemning her. Henry's frail hands clawed at the air. She keeps me here. She won't let me move." Amina's voice, low but steady, cut through the din. "I wasn't hurting him. He was trying to stand. He could have fallen. I was only—" "Enough," Richard roared. His chest heaved as he stepped into the room, towering over her. In that instant, all his upbringing, all his inherited prejudices, hardened into a single, unyielding judgment. The picture looked clear. A black maid restraining a white patriarch, and in Richard's world, appearances had always outweighed explanations. Amina lowered her gaze, her hands trembling, yet there was a spark of dignity in her posture. "If you must condemn me, sir, then do so, but I swear to you, I meant only to protect him." The words hung in the room like smoke, dismissed almost before they were spoken. Margaret folded her arms, lips curling into a thin smile that Richard did not notice. The other staff murmured assent, their whispers layering over one another until truth itself seemed drowned. Richard clenched his fists. His father's cries echoed in his ears, louder than reason, louder than compassion. In that moment, he saw only betrayal. "Lock her in the basement," he ordered coldly, "until I decide what to do." Two staff members seized Amina by the arms. She did not resist. Her dark eyes lingered on Richard, calm in their own way, as though trying to tell him something words could not. Then she lowered her head, allowing herself to be led away. The door closed behind them. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Richard stood rooted to the spot, his breath ragged, His father slumped back in his chair, mumbling incoherently now, drained by the outburst. Margaret placed a hand on Richard's arm with the familiarity of someone who had long managed him as much as served him. "You did the right thing, sir. You have to protect your father. That girl, she was never to be trusted." But Richard did not answer. His eyes lingered on the scattered medicine bottles by his father's bedside, the slightly smudged papers on the desk, the pen left uncapped with ink bleeding into the wood. Something was off, though he couldn't name it yet. Still, the image of Amina's calm defiance burned in his mind. He had condemned her, yes, but deep inside, something unsettled whispered. What if he had been wrong? The opening of a fracture, a seed of doubt, buried under pride, under prejudice, under rage. For now, however, the household's verdict was unanimous. Amina Johnson was branded a traitor, a danger within the Sterling home. And so the story begins. One woman's dignity pitted against an empire of wealth, suspicion, and lies. Amina Johnson sat alone in the dim basement room, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The lock had clicked shut only minutes ago, but already the judgment of the household pressed heavier than iron. Dust drifted in the pale shaft of light slicing through a narrow window, painting her face with a faint glow. She clasped her hands in her lap and whispered words that no one upstairs wanted to hear. "I did not harm him. I was only trying to help." But above her head, louder voices had already drowned her out. Voices polished by privilege, confident in their authority. Henry Sterling, the patriarch of the family, frail and confused in his declining years, had screamed it himself, "She's dangerous. Keep her away from me." His dementia tangled truth and terror until no one could separate them. And Margaret Collins, the long-serving housekeeper with her rigid bun and calculating eyes, had seized the moment. "I've warned you all," she declared. "She lingers outside his door at night, always lurking. I knew she'd show her true nature eventually." Other staff, eager to align with Margaret's power, nodded quickly. "She's strange. Never trust her. You know where she comes from." Richard Sterling listened, arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. Richard was a billionaire who had mastered boardrooms and mergers, but tonight in his own mansion he felt strangely unmoored. He looked at his father's pale face, at Margaret's accusing glare, at the trembling silence of his staff, and in that silence prejudice spoke louder than reason. Amina was only a maid, a poor black woman hired cheaply, tolerated but never truly respected. Trust in her had always been fragile. Now it broke completely. Richard gave the order in a clipped voice. "Keep her downstairs until I decide what to do." The door shut on Amina's freedom, but not on her resolve. In the stillness of the basement, she replayed the moment over and over. The terror in Mr. Sterling's eyes, the sharp disbelief in Richard's voice, Margaret's triumphant smirk. Yet instead of breaking, something inside her solidified. Her dark eyes glimmered, not with fear, but with a stubborn dignity, as though she carried a truth too important to surrender. She thought back to the path that had led her here. Her mother had raised her alone, working herself to exhaustion, scrubbing floors in homes that gleamed with wealth she could never touch. When illness claimed her, Amina had been left with no family, no savings, just the will to survive. She had finished high school at a community program, then stepped into the world with nothing but resilience and her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "A clean conscience is heavier than gold, Amina, and no one can take it from you." The job at the Sterling estate had been a lifeline. It paid enough for rent, for food, for the barest foothold in a world that was never built for her. And though she endured the sneers, the whispers, the invisible wall between herself and those she served, she endured with patience, because endurance, she knew, was sometimes the only form of power the powerless could wield. Upstairs, Richard Sterling paced the corridor outside his father's room. The mansion, lined with portraits of generations of Sterlings, felt suddenly oppressive. He prided himself on clarity in business, on seeing through lies across a negotiation table. But now, inside his own home, clarity eluded him. On Henry's nightstand sat a bottle of pills. Richard lifted it, shook it. The label read, Memantine 10 milligram, but the tablets inside were wrong, larger, a different shade. His frown deepened. Then the papers, medical notes in disarray. signatures that didn't quite match the steady hand of Dr. Raymond Ellis, their longtime physician. Richard tilted the paper closer to the lamp, his stomach tightening. The lines looked forged. "Strange," he muttered. Yet his thoughts circled back to Amina. It was easier to believe she had tampered with the medicine, easier to believe she had forged the papers than to confront the possibility of betrayal from those he had trusted for decades. Still, he remembered her eyes as the guards led her downstairs. Not the wild eyes of guilt, but calm, steady, filled with something closer to sorrow than fear. The image unsettled him. In the basement, Amina sat on the edge of her narrow cot, fingers tracing the outline of the locket she always carried. Inside was a worn photograph of her mother, her face tired but kind. That single image was her inheritance, her reminder that integrity mattered more than survival. She closed her eyes and thought of Henry Sterling, the man upstairs, confused and trembling. Despite his accusations, she had cared for him daily. She had fed him, read aloud to him, shielded him from the harshness of staff who lacked patience. She had noticed the irregularities, pills changed too often, his lucidity slipping, and then, on days when she quietly skipped a dose, his mind flickering back into clarity, however briefly. She had kept empty blister packs tucked away, recorded odd symptoms in a hidden notebook. She had begun to suspect something sinister. And tonight, when she had stepped between Henry and the open door, it had not been to restrain him but to stop him from tumbling forward in his confusion. But who would believe her now? That night, Richard walked into the breakfast room, where Margaret Collins presided over the silver trays as though she owned them. She poured his coffee with hands too steady, a smile too polished. "You did the right thing, sir," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "That girl was never fit for this house. Trouble from the start." Richard nodded stiffly, though unease prickled at the back of his neck. He thought again of the mismatched pills, the forged signatures, the disarray in his father's room. Later, alone in his study, he spread the medical papers across the desk. The inconsistencies piled higher, dosages that made no sense, refills out of sync with doctors' visits, ink that smelled fresh, as if it had been pressed onto the page recently. His instincts screamed contradiction, yet his prejudices whispered certainty. Amina was the outsider, the suspect, the scapegoat. And yet, his mind, trained in the ruthless clarity of finance, tugged at the thread of doubt. He had built an empire on knowing when a story was too convenient. Now, in his own house, the story felt too convenient. The following evening, he descended into the basement. The lock scraped open. Amina sat on the cot, hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she had been expecting him. "You maintain your innocence," Richard said flatly. She raised her eyes, steady as stone. "Because it is the truth. My father swore you attacked him. Your father is ill. His mind falters, but yours does not. You see more than you admit, Mr. Sterling." His jaw tightened. "You think you know me?" "No," she said softly. "But I know the look of a man who fears he has condemned the wrong person. I know the weight of injustice because I live beneath it every day." Her words cut deeper than she could have known. Richard turned, left without another word, but her voice followed him, like an echo he could not escape. By the third day, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The pill bottles kept changing. The signatures grew stranger. And Henry himself, in rare moments when Amina had secretly skipped doses, seemed to claw his way back toward coherence. The truth pressed against Richard from all sides, yet every instinct demanded he blame the easy target locked in the basement. But deep down, another voice stirred. Had he imprisoned the one person in this house still loyal to his father? The question lodged in Richard Sterling's chest like a thorn, and once it lodged there, it refused to let him breathe easily again. The days that followed were a crucible for Amina Johnson. Confined to her duties but stripped of trust, the young black maid became the object of relentless humiliation. Margaret Collins, the housekeeper, used every opportunity to tighten her grip on the mansion. Margaret, with her gray hair pulled into a severe bun and her voice like a whip, had served the Sterling family for decades. She wore loyalty like armor, but it was loyalty to her own power, not to truth. "Clean it again," Margaret barked one morning, pointing at the polished banister already gleaming under the chandelier's light. If dirt is invisible, it's because you missed it. Amina bent silently, cloth in hand. Each command was delivered not for cleanliness, but for degradation. She scrubbed floors already spotless, lifted crates twice her weight, and was forced to wash linens until her hands cracked raw. Servants whispered in corners, sneered when she passed. "Strange girl," they said, always lingering near the old man's room. Margaret's whispers carried further. "She's dangerous, mark my words." Amina endured as she always had. But inside, her resolve burned brighter. She had begun to gather proof, empty blister packs hidden in her apron, a notebook of symptoms carefully recorded, dates and hours marked with precision. To the others, she seemed broken. In truth, she was preparing. Then came the night, when everything erupted. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Sterling mansion, wind howling through the trees outside. The corridors, dimly lit, echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps. Margaret Collins stormed into Henry Sterling's room, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Caught you," she cried. "I knew it." Richard Sterling, alerted by the clamor, rushed down the hallway and flung the door open. The scene before him froze the breath in his lungs. On the carpet, Amina knelt beside Henry Sterling's bed. Tears streaked her face, her hands trembling as she clutched a syringe. Henry, pale and frail, whimpered incoherently, shrinking back. Margaret stood at the doorway, triumphant, her fingers stabbing toward Amina. "There, do you see? She was about to poison him." The words struck like a hammer. Other staff crowded in, gasping, muttering. Richard's face darkened, his voice sharp. "What is the meaning of this?" Amina's cry split the air. "No, you don't understand." Her voice shook with desperation, but her eyes were fierce. "I was never going to harm him. I was keeping this to prove the truth." Margaret sneered, her lips curling in contempt. "Truth? The truth is she's a liar and a thief. You'll kill us all with your madness if you don't act now, sir." The staff closed in. A chorus of voices rose. "Call the police. She must be removed. She's dangerous." Amina's breath came fast, cornered on the carpet. She could feel the walls closing in. The years of prejudice pressing down, the certainty that silence would damn her forever. With a sudden surge, she raised her voice, fierce enough to cut through the clamor. "It's her!" She thrust the syringe upward, clutching it like evidence rather than a weapon. "Margaret is the one switching his pills. I kept this needle only to collect samples to prove what she's done." The room went silent for a beat, shocked by her defiance. Then, as if on cue, the uproar returned, louder than before. "Lies! How dare she? Take her away!" Richard's hand hovered over his phone, torn between duty and doubt. His father, trembling on the bed, muttered incoherently, caught in the fog that had shrouded him for months. And then, a sound like a breaking tide. Henry Sterling's voice, clear, firm, rising from the bed. "Not her!" The crowd stilled. Richard's head snapped toward his father. Henry pushed himself upright with trembling arms. His frail frame seemed infused with sudden strength, his cloudy eyes clearing to reveal something sharper, familiar, the man he had once been. His voice, though shaking, carried conviction. "Not her. It was her. Margaret. She gave me those strange pills. She clouded my mind day after day, until I thought I was lost forever." The room turned to stone. Richard staggered back, disbelief etched into every line of his face. Margaret's mouth fell open, her mask slipping for the first time. "Sir," she stammered, her composure cracking. "You're confused. He doesn't know what he's saying. He's been senile for months." But Richard's eyes narrowed. He saw his father's gaze, lucid and fierce, unshaken. This was no delusion. Henry's voice grew stronger, passion flaring through exhaustion. "I remember now. The taste was wrong. The hours blurred after I swallowed them. But when Amina refused me those pills, when she shielded me from them, the fog began to lift. She protected me. And you, Margaret, you betrayed me." The words thundered in the silence. For months, Henry had been treated as a ghost in his own home, his mind dismissed as unreliable. Now his testimony cut through the lies with surgical clarity. Amina, still kneeling, seized the moment. Her voice steadied, rich with long-buried evidence. She reached into her apron and pulled free the hidden blister packs, the small notebook she had guarded like a secret scripture. "These are the pills I saved," she said, laying them out on the nightstand with trembling hands. "And here are the notes of every symptom. Every day he slipped further away. I kept them, waiting for the moment when truth could be heard." Richard's hand closed around the notebook. He flipped through page after page. Dates, times, symptoms, meticulous in detail. His throat tightened. It was undeniable. The staff shifted uneasily. Whispers rippled through the room. Margaret's face flushed with panic. "Lies, fabrications. Anyone could have written that." "Enough," Richard said, his voice low, cold as steel. For the first time, his gaze turned toward Margaret not with trust, but with suspicion. He saw the cracks in her mask, the fear trembling beneath her fury. Amina's shoulders heaved with exhaustion, but her eyes lifted to meet his. For weeks she had been painted as the villain. Her loyalty twisted into suspicion. In one night, the tide had turned, not because she convinced them, but because Henry Sterling himself had risen from the shadows of his illness to speak the truth. Richard looked between them, his father awake at last, his maid steady in her integrity, and his housekeeper exposed in the sudden glare of justice. The weight of revelation pressed down on the room. Everything had shifted, and Richard knew nothing in this house would ever be the same again. The silence after Henry Sterling's unexpected testimony hung in the air like a suspended blade. No one dared move. Margaret Collins, the veteran housekeeper with her iron composure now cracking, opened her mouth to protest again, but Richard Sterling's voice cut through like a verdict. "Enough," he said, steel in his tone. "We end this charade tonight." For decades, Margaret had strutted these halls as if she owned them. She was the keeper of keys, the voice of order, the shadow whispering advice in corners. But now, under the blaze of truth, her authority shriveled. Richard pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and pressed a number. His eyes never left her face. "This is Richard Sterling. Send the police to my estate. We have a case of elder abuse and attempted poisoning." Gasps rippled among the staff. Margaret's mask finally shattered. "You can't," she shrieked, her voice raw, stripped of its false dignity. "I've served this family longer than you've been alive. I kept this house running while you were out making deals in glass towers. I'm the one who protected him when no one else cared." Henry Sterling, leaning heavily against his pillows, rasped a reply that silenced the room. "Protected me? You stole my mind. You turned my days into shadows. If Amina had not stood between me and your pills, I would be a corpse in my own bed by now." Margaret lunged toward the bed, desperate, her face twisted with panic. "You don't know what you're saying. You're sick, confused." Richard intercepted her, his voice booming with finality. "He knows. And I know. You're finished here." Two security guards, long silent in the background, stepped forward at Richard's command. Margaret struggled, her cries shrill. "This girl tricked you. She planted those pills. Don't be blind, Richard. She'll ruin you all." Her words were drowned by the click of handcuffs as the police arrived minutes later. Ushered in by Richard's men, Margaret was dragged down the corridor, her wails echoing off the marble walls. A woman who had ruled with fear was reduced to a figure of disgrace, swallowed by the very house she once commanded. The storm outside began to break as if the sky itself were exhaling. In the hush that followed, Richard turned to Amina Johnson. She stood still, exhausted, her uniform stained, her eyes rimmed with tears but blazing with an unyielding fire. She had been mocked, confined, accused, nearly destroyed, and yet here she was, vindicated by truth itself. Richard's throat tightened as he stepped closer. "Amina," he said, voice low, almost hoarse. "I was blind. I doubted you when I should have defended you. You did not only save my father's life, you saved this family from rotting under betrayal. I owe you more than words." Amina lowered her gaze, humility softening her strength. "I did only what was right," she whispered. "Even when no one believed me, I knew I could not abandon him. That was never an option." From the bed, Henry reached out with a trembling hand. His face, lined with age, now bore a clarity absent for months. Tears glistened in his eyes. "Child," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, You carried me when even my own son could not see. You gave me back my mind, my dignity. From this day forward, you are no longer a servant in this house. You are my daughter." The room seemed to shift. Servants who once sneered now looked on in awe. The billionaire heir bowed his head, humbled by the quiet maid who had proven stronger than all their titles. Amina knelt by Henry's bedside, her hand enclosed in his. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of shame now, but of release. "I only ever wanted to serve with honesty," she said softly, "and to hold to what my mother taught me. That truth always finds its way through lies." The weeks that followed remade the Sterling estate. Margaret Collins stood trial, the evidence irrefutable. Falsified medical reports, tampered prescriptions, siphoned accounts. She was sentenced for her crimes, her name forever linked with treachery. Henry, under proper treatment, regained much of his clarity. Though frail, his spirit was renewed, and he insisted on walking through the gardens each morning with Amina at his side, introducing her not as the maid, but as my daughter. For Richard, the ordeal left a scar and a lesson. He publicly restored Amina's dignity, addressing the household staff in a gathering under the chandelier. "This woman," he declared, voice resonant, "has shown more courage and integrity than all of us combined. She stood firm when we faltered. Let it be known, she is part of this family." He went further still. He arranged for Amina to begin formal training in nursing, sponsoring her tuition at a nearby program. "Your gift," he told her, "is not just loyalty, it is care, and the world needs it." Amina accepted with humility, though her eyes shone with dreams she had long buried. For years she had worked only to survive. Now she could begin to live. One dawn, weeks later, the estate stood in golden silence. The air smelled of rain-washed earth, and the garden sparkled with dew. Amina stepped onto the balcony in a simple dress, no longer bound by a servant's uniform. She breathed deeply, the sun warming her skin, her posture tall and proud. She was not the woman who had once been scorned, cornered, accused. She was something else now, a figure reborn, a living testament to truth unbroken. Behind her, Henry Sterling called gently from his chair by the window. "Daughter, come. The day is waiting." And Amina turned, her face radiant with quiet triumph. No longer the overlooked maid. She had become the symbol of loyalty and justice, the proof that even in the darkest halls of suspicion, truth can blaze a path to light. Margaret Collins spent her remaining years not in mansions but in prison walls, a woman undone by her own greed. Richard Sterling became more cautious, tempered by humility, his empire now carrying the mark of his father's near ruin and his maid's redemption. And Amina Johnson, once invisible, once ridiculed, walked forward with a new name upon her shoulders. Not servant, not suspect, but daughter, healer, and guardian of truth. Message. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, disguised as weakness, dismissed as insignificance. We witnessed a woman once ridiculed as a servant stand unshaken against lies, betrayal, and the weight of power itself. Amina Johnson's story reminds us that integrity is not about the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. The very voice thought too small to matter became the voice that saved a family, restored dignity, and toppled deceit. And perhaps that is the deeper truth. Loyalty is not measured by wealth or position, but by the courage to protect what is right when it would be easier to walk away. In a world quick to judge, Amina shows us the quiet force of justice.